He had patrolled this reserve for many years and believed he knew every trail and every stretch of shore. But one day, he noticed a strange whirlpool in a quiet mountain lake. At first, it seemed harmless, yet with each passing week it grew stronger until it began pulling everything around it inward. What was hidden beneath the bottom shattered the illusion of safety and changed the fate of the lake forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The mountain reserve had earned its reputation as a place of perfect stability long before most of the surrounding towns had even been founded. Glacial valleys folded into one another like quiet pages of a book that nobody had bothered to rewrite in generations. The main road ended several miles before the lake, dissolving into a gravel track that only park vehicles were permitted to use, and from there the landscape belonged to wind, water, and time alone. Visitors who reached the inner basin often said that the place felt insulated from the world, as if the mountains themselves bent around it to keep noise and history out. The high lake at the heart of the reserve was fed by a network of narrow snowmelt streams that braided down from the ridgelines and vanished beneath carpets of moss and sedge before surfacing again at the shoreline. There was no visible outlet. The water level rose and fell with the seasons in patterns so predictable that charts from the 1970s still matched current measurements within a few centimeters. For decades, the lake had been treated as a benchmark ecosystem. Its fish populations were stable, its birds returned to the same nesting coves every year, and the ring of wetlands surrounding it acted as a natural filter that kept the water clear even during heavy spring runoff. Motorized boats were banned, camping was restricted to designated sites far from the shore, and every trail was designed to keep human weight from eroding the fragile margins. The reserve's operating manuals devoted entire chapters to this single body of water. It was not simply scenery, but a living system whose balance depended on 1,000 small interactions that nobody ever saw and few ever questioned. The ranger assigned to the inner basin had learned that lesson early in his career. He had arrived at the reserve more than a decade earlier, transferring from a coastal park where rescues and storms were routine. Here, the danger was subtler. It hid in quiet deviations and details that only someone who walked the same ground every week could recognize. His name was Marcus Hale, and the senior staff often joked that he could tell the time of year by the way the reeds leaned toward the water. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dark-skinned, with a voice that rarely rose above calm instruction. He kept a handwritten journal, even though the service had long since switched to digital reporting, insisting that writing forced him to notice what typing allowed him to overlook. His life in the reserve was defined by rhythm. Every morning began with the same circuit, a loop that traced the western shoreline before climbing a low ridge and returning along the marsh flats. He inspected the buoy markers that warned kayakers away from sensitive breeding areas, checked that the emergency ladders on the fishing platforms were intact, and paused at 3 fixed stakes driven into the mud decades earlier to record the lake's level. The routine was so deeply ingrained that he could have walked it blindfolded. It was during one of these ordinary mornings, under a pale sky streaked with the last remnants of a retreating storm, that he noticed something that did not belong. At first, it was no more than a distortion on the surface. The wind had died overnight, leaving the lake glassy and reflective, and yet a small patch near the far cliffs refused to settle. The water there curved inward on itself, as if an invisible finger were stirring a slow spiral beneath the skin of the lake. Marcus watched it from a distance, squinting into the light, and dismissed it as a quirk of lingering currents from the storm. The basin was deep in that corner, a shadowed amphitheater of rock, where eddies sometimes persisted longer than expected. He made a note in his journal anyway. The entry was brief, just a line about unusual surface motion at the northern wall. It was not the first time he had recorded something that later proved meaningless. A branch fallen where it had never fallen before, a sandbar shifted by spring floods, a bird nesting in the wrong tree. Most of these observations were absorbed back into the normal life of the reserve without consequence, but the spiral did not vanish. It remained through the late morning, through the afternoon, through the quiet hours before dusk when the lake usually lay still as a polished stone. Marcus found himself glancing toward it whenever he could, a reflex he could not quite explain. It was not dramatic. There was no roar, no violent churning. It was simply there, a persistent inward curve that caught floating pollen and pulled it into a faint rotating line. By the time he returned to the ranger station that evening, a sensation of unease had settled into him like grit under the skin. He reviewed old photographs on his office computer, zooming in on the same stretch of water from previous years. There was nothing. The surface had always been uniform, broken only by ripples from birds or sudden rain. He closed the files and opened his journal again, adding another line beneath the first. Still no conclusions, only facts. Over the following days, the distortion grew easier to see. The lake remained calm, but the spiral widened, its edges now clearly defined by a gathering seam of foam and plant debris. Marcus marked its position with landmarks on the shore, measuring the angle from a dead pine and the jut of a slate outcrop. Each day, the seam drifted a fraction closer to the center of the basin. The water level at his measuring stakes dipped a millimeter below its expected mark, then another. These were changes so small that nobody without his records would have noticed them, but to Marcus they read like the first irregular beats in a heart that had never skipped before. He began to hear something as well. It was not constant, and never loud enough to alarm tourists, but in the early mornings, when the birds had not yet started their calls, he could detect a low resonance near the far shore. It was like the murmur of distant machinery carried through the ground, a pressure rather than a sound. The first time he knelt at the water's edge and pressed his palm to a flat stone, he felt a faint tremor pass through it and into his hand. He withdrew quickly, unsettled by the intimacy of the sensation. Still, there was nothing that could justify escalation. No alarms, no injuries, no reports from visitors. He updated his supervisors with a concise message that described persistent, localized surface motion and minor level deviation, attaching his measurements and images. The response was polite and non-committal, advising continued observation. It was the kind of reply that closed cases rather than opening them. The reserve went about its business. Families hiked the boardwalks, their children scattering minnows along the shallows. Photographers set up tripods at sunrise to capture the mirror of the peaks in the lake. None of them noticed the slow inward pull that Marcus had begun to sense whenever he stood within sight of the northern wall. He found himself lingering at the end of his patrols, watching the seam of debris tighten, watching as small sticks that drifted too near vanished beneath the surface without a splash. One afternoon, a sudden breeze swept across the basin, wrinkling the water into a million overlapping ripples. For a moment, Marcus felt relief, certain that the distortion would dissolve into the general motion. Instead, it persisted, the spiral cutting through the wind's pattern like a thumbprint pressed into soft glass. The sight struck him with a clarity that was almost physical. Whatever was happening was not on the surface. It was coming from below. That evening, he reviewed the historical operations maps that were kept in a dusty filing cabinet behind the station. Most of the pages concerned fire breaks, trail maintenance, and flood management, but buried among them were yellowed sheets stamped with industrial seals. They depicted exploratory zones, boreholes, and subterranean features that had never made it into public brochures. One faded annotation marked a section beneath the northern cliffs with a vague phrase about discontinued works. Marcus traced the line with his finger, aligning it in his mind with the coordinates he had been collecting all week. By the time he locked up the station and stepped back into the cool mountain air, the lake lay hidden in darkness beyond the trees, its surface invisible but no longer silent in his thoughts. The reserve that had always been calm was changing, not with the drama of storms or floods, but with the quiet persistence of something breaking out of sight. He walked back to his quarters, knowing that tomorrow he would not be able to treat the spiral as a curiosity. It had become the center of his attention, a question mark etched into water, and the first sign that the stability he had trusted all his life might have been resting on something far more fragile than anyone had imagined. Marcus woke before dawn with the image of the spiral still fixed behind his eyes. The night had been restless, broken by the same low murmur he had noticed by the shore, a vibration so faint that he could not be sure whether it came from the lake or from his own unease. By the time the first gray light reached the valley, he was already walking the trail toward the northern wall, his boots tapping a rhythm that had never before felt hurried. The lake lay calm under the pale sky, its surface smooth as a pane of dark glass, and yet the distortion was there waiting for him. The seam of foam and drifting pollen that had marked the spiral the previous evening had not dispersed overnight. If anything, it had tightened, its arc sharper, its inward pull more assertive. He stood at his usual observation point and watched for nearly an hour, recording the slow dance of debris as it drifted from the outer ring toward the center and then vanished as though swallowed. He pulled out a biodegradable marker, a small block of compressed reed fiber used to trace currents without polluting the water. He tossed it gently a few meters from the seam and tracked its movement. Instead of drifting randomly across the lake as it should have, the marker curved inward, its path bending into the same spiral that the foam described. The motion was not violent. It was steady, deliberate, like the turn of a slow screw threading into unseen wood. Back at the measuring stakes, he knelt and compared the water line to his notebook. The level had dropped again, barely perceptible to anyone else but undeniable to him. Another millimeter gone, then perhaps 2. He circled the shoreline, checking for new inflows or leaks, but the tributary streams remained clear and strong, feeding the lake as they always had. Nothing on the surface explained why the basin was losing water. By mid-morning, the first kayakers appeared, gliding along the calmer southern shore. Marcus watched them with a tightness in his chest that he had never felt before. He moved to intercept them, steering them away from the northern half with a casual authority that did not invite questions. When they drifted off, he returned to his station and uploaded the morning's images, annotating them with timestamps and coordinates. His report grew longer, more detailed, its tone still factual but weighted with the implication that he was watching something evolve. As the day wore on, the changes became easier to see even for untrained eyes. The foam seam thickened, gathering leaves, pollen, and the occasional feather into a pale ribbon that circled the same invisible drain. The water near the spiral darkened, not with shadow but with depth, a hollow that seemed to sink below the surrounding surface. When a sudden gust rattled the reeds along the marsh flats, The ripples raced across the lake and collided with the spiral only to be bent inward, swallowed by the persistent rotation. It was as though two different sets of rules were governing the same body of water. The sound returned with the afternoon heat. Marcus heard it first as he paused on the ridge trail, a soft tremor that he felt more than he heard. He followed it downslope, moving carefully until he stood on a narrow shelf of rock directly above the spiral. There, with his boots planted against the stone, he pressed his palm to the ground and closed his eyes. The vibration was clearer here, a low continuous resonance that traveled through the rock and into his bones. It reminded him of standing too close to a distant train line, of the earth humming under invisible pressure. He made another entry in his journal, describing the sensation in careful language that could not quite capture the unease it inspired. He tried to measure it with the tools he had, placing a small accelerometer on the rock and noting its readings. The device barely registered anything out of the ordinary, yet his body insisted that something was wrong. The dissonance between instrument and instinct gnawed at him. The first incident came 2 days later. A couple of college students had rented kayaks from a concessionaire at the park's edge and decided to explore the lake's northern reaches despite the soft barrier buoys that marked the sensitive zone. Marcus saw them from across the basin, their bright hulls sliding toward the darker water. He radioed the main station to log the violation and then headed down the trail at a pace that surprised even him. By the time he reached the shore, one of the students was already struggling to keep her kayak straight as the water began to pull at its bow. He shouted instructions from the bank, waving them back, but the wind carried his voice away. The second student managed to turn his craft and paddle free, but the first lost her grip on a loose water bottle. Marcus watched in helpless focus as the bottle spun once on the surface and then darted toward the spiral, vanishing beneath the water without so much as a bubble. The girl froze, her kayak rocking, and only the intervention of her friend prevented her from drifting closer. They both made it back to safety, shaken and pale, and Marcus escorted them to the ranger station where he documented the event with a steadiness that belied the pulse in his ears. After they left, he stood alone by the lake, replaying the sight of the disappearing bottle in his mind. Objects did not simply vanish in this basin. Everything that entered the water here eventually washed ashore or was caught by the marshes. The spiral had changed that rule. That evening, he called his supervisor directly, breaking the usual chain of written reports. He described the incident, the measurements, the vibrations, the slow but consistent drop in water level. There was a pause on the line, the kind that stretched just long enough to suggest that his words were being weighed against budgets and protocols. The reply was cautious, urging him to continue monitoring while higher authorities reviewed the data. It was not a dismissal, but it was not the urgency he felt either. As the week progressed, the spiral grew bolder. It no longer confined itself to a narrow seam, but spread its influence in subtle arcs across the northern half of the lake. Marcus placed additional markers along the shore, comparing the daily positions of fallen leaves and drifting reeds. Each comparison told the same story. Everything was inching toward a single point. The birds sensed it too. A colony of terns that had nested on a low gravel spit abandoned the site without explanation, leaving behind half-built nests that were soon lapped by water that should not have reached them for another month. Schools of fish that once shimmered in the shallows were replaced by empty water, and the occasional stunned specimen floating belly up, its gills clogged with fine silt. The marsh grasses nearest the spiral took on a dull gray sheen, as though dusted with something that did not belong. The sound deepened. what had been a murmur became a persistent undertone that Marcus could not escape even in his sleep. He found himself waking in the dark with the sensation of movement beneath the floorboards, a distant pull that mirrored the one he watched every day on the lake's surface. The reserve was no longer a place of stillness. It was becoming a place of tension, stretched tight around a force that no one else could yet see. On a cool morning at the end of the week, Marcus stood by the northern cliffs and watched a dead branch drift into the outer edge of the spiral. He expected it to circle once or twice and then break free, as larger debris often did in ordinary eddies. Instead, it slid inward as if guided by rails, its bark catching the light for a final moment before it tilted and sank. The water closed over it without a sound. He wrote in his journal that night with a firmness that left an imprint on the page beneath. The phenomenon was no longer an anomaly. It was a pattern, stable in location, increasing in strength, altering the behavior of water, wildlife, and visitors alike. He could feel the reserve slipping from the category of managed wilderness into something less predictable, something that demanded more than observation. As he set the journal aside, the low resonance thrummed through the walls of his quarters, a reminder that whatever lay beneath the lake was still moving, still drawing the basin toward a future that none of his training had prepared him to face. The week after the incident with the drifting bottle marked a turning point in Marcus Hale's perception of the lake. What had once been a question of motion had become a matter of substance. He noticed it first on a cool morning when the rising sun caught the rocks along the northern shoreline at just the right angle. The stones that had always glistened with a simple wet sheen now bore faint white traces, as though someone had dusted them with chalk and then tried to wipe it away. He crouched and rubbed one with his thumb. The residue did not behave like dried algae or pollen. It smeared slightly and left behind a slick film that felt different from anything he had encountered in the basin before. As he walked farther along the water line, he saw the same pale stain on driftwood and on the stems of marsh plants that leaned toward the spiral. It was subtle, nothing a casual hiker would remark upon, but to Marcus it was a foreign signature. He filled a small vial with lake water from just outside the vortex and another from a quiet inlet on the southern shore, labeling them carefully before tucking them into his pack. By the time he reached the ranger station, the faint mineral tang lingered on his fingers, an aftertaste that did not belong in a high-mountain freshwater lake. The tests he could perform on site were limited, but even those hinted at change. The northern sample registered a slight increase in conductivity, a whisper of dissolved material that should not have been there. He cross-checked his results twice, calibrating his instruments with distilled water, then wrote the numbers into his journal with a tight hand. His training had taught him to treat every reading with skepticism, yet the trend was emerging too consistently to ignore. The lake was not only moving, it was being altered. That afternoon, he drove down to the Regional Archive facility, a low concrete building that most park staff visited only when a trail collapsed or a flood redrew the landscape. Inside, the air was dry and tinged with paper dust, and the walls were lined with cabinets whose labels bore dates stretching back to the mid-20th century. Marcus requested everything that referenced subsurface activity in the northern quadrant of the reserve. The archivist raised an eyebrow, surprised by the specificity, but complied. Hours later, he was seated at a long table, spreading out brittle maps and yellowed reports. Most of them concerned mundane matters such as soil surveys and erosion studies, but buried among them were documents stamped with corporate logos that had long since faded into obscurity. They detailed exploratory drilling conducted in the 1950s, a period when mineral speculation had swept through the region. The language was technical and evasive, full of phrases about temporary closures and deferred maintenance. One report referenced a borehole that intersected an unexpected formation beneath what was now the northern wall of the lake. The subsequent pages were missing. He traced the sketched outlines of the exploratory zone with his finger, overlaying them in his mind with the coordinates he had been recording all week. The alignment was too precise to be coincidence. Whatever lay beneath the basin was not a natural cavern formed by water alone. It had been disturbed by human hands, then abandoned and allowed to fade from collective memory. When he returned to the reserve that evening, the spiral was more pronounced than ever. It now drew a visible funnel in the water, a shallow depression that caught the low light and bent it inward. Marcus stood at the edge of the marsh and watched a flock of ducks circle the basin twice before settling far from the northern wall, their instincts guiding them away from a danger no signpost could explain. Over the next few days, the changes multiplied. Tiny fissures appeared in the damp soil along the ridge trail, hairline cracks that traced irregular patterns between the roots of spruce and fir. A wooden sign that had stood upright for years developed a sudden lean, its base sinking by a fraction of an inch each night. Marcus measured the angle with a pocket level, returning at dawn and dusk to chart the subtle tilt. The ground was subsiding, not everywhere, but in pockets that clustered like shadows around the spiral's hidden anchor point. Visitors began to comment on the smell. It was not strong enough to drive them away, but it clung to the air near the northern shore, a faint metallic note that mingled with the clean mountain scent. One family complained that their children felt lightheaded after skipping stones too close to the darkened water. Marcus filed the report and added it to the growing dossier he was compiling, a silent plea for attention in the form of facts. He could feel the pressure building within himself as well. Every evening he pored over his notes, comparing the day's measurements with those from the week before. The downward trend was undeniable. The lake was losing more water than the tributaries could supply, and the spiral was accelerating the loss. He began to wake at odd hours, the vibration that had once been an occasional curiosity now threading through his sleep like a persistent hum. When he finally contacted his supervisors again, he did so with a packet of evidence that filled an entire digital folder. Conductivity readings, photographs of the residue, scans of the archival maps, diagrams showing the correlation between the subsidence zones and the vortex. This time, the reply was not merely cautious. It was tinged with concern. He was instructed to maintain a heightened level of observation and to be prepared for a site visit from external specialists. The relief he felt at that message was tempered by the pace of the changes around him. He spent the next morning reinforcing the soft barriers that kept visitors away from the northern half of the lake, moving the buoys outward to create a wider buffer. As he worked, a pair of grebes skimmed the water's surface and then veered sharply away from the spiral, their wings beating in short bursts as though they were fighting a current he could not see. By the end of the week, the lake no longer looked like the one he had known. The northern basin was darker, its surface perpetually dimpled by the inward pull. The marsh grasses along that shore lay flattened, coated in a dull film that resisted the rain. Marcus walked the ridge trail and paused at each new crack in the soil, committing their shapes to memory in the way he once had with bird calls and cloud patterns. One evening, as the sun bled red through the haze, he stood at the edge of the spiral and dropped a small stone straight down. Instead of sinking in a clean line, it was caught in a sideways drift, arcing toward the unseen center before disappearing. He waited for the telltale plunk of it striking bottom, but the sound never came. The water closed over the disturbance, smoothing itself as though nothing had happened. In his journal that night, he wrote that the reserve was speaking in a new language, one that blended human error with geological consequence. The calm that had defined the lake for generations was unraveling thread by thread, and each sign pointed not outward to the mountains or the sky, but downward into a darkness that no one had charted in decades. He ended the entry with a note to himself to prepare for the arrival of the specialists, knowing in his bones that observation alone was no longer enough to hold the line. The specialists arrived 2 days after Marcus sent his latest report, their convoy of white utility trucks grinding up the gravel road that ended at the ranger station like an invasion from another world. He stood on the porch and watched the dust clouds drift into the trees, feeling the odd mixture of relief and apprehension that came with the presence of people who were not part of the reserve's slow rhythm. The team was composed of hydrologists, technical divers, and a pair of engineers who oversaw the deployment of a remotely operated vehicle. Their equipment filled the clearing with the metallic scent of cables and diesel, a sharp contrast to the resin and wet earth that usually dominated the air. From the outset, the meeting of approaches was uneasy. Marcus spread his journals and photographs across the hood of his truck, explaining the pattern he had been tracking for weeks, while one of the hydrologists nodded with a half-smile that suggested curiosity rather than conviction. They spoke of localized currents, of pressure differentials created by temperature gradients, of natural sinkholes that could form and stabilize on their own. Marcus listened, letting them finish before pointing out the aligned cracks along the ridge trail and the mineral traces on the shoreline rocks. He said nothing dramatic. He let the data speak for him. By mid-morning, they were setting up along the northern shore, a floating platform anchored just beyond the soft barrier of buoys. The lake lay deceptively placid under a high blue sky, but the spiral was clearly visible now, its presence betrayed by a darkened patch that refused to flatten even when a breeze skimmed the surface. Cables were unspooled with practiced efficiency, the ROV cradled in a harness like some compact mechanical creature waiting to be released. The initial scans were conducted from the platform using side-scan sonar. Marcus watched the monitor over the shoulder of the technician as ghostly shapes resolved into something like a map of the lake bed. At first, it looked ordinary, a gentle slope of sediment and scattered rock. Then, as the sweep moved closer to the spiral's epicenter, the image warped. The smooth contours of the basin gave way to an irregular void, a region where the signal thinned and scattered as though it were passing through open space. The hydrologist leaned closer to the screen, his skepticism replaced by a frown. They marked the coordinates and initiated a second pass. This time, the anomaly was unmistakable. Beneath the layer of silt lay a cavity of uncertain shape, its edges jagged and uneven. It was not the clean bowl of a natural sinkhole, but something that suggested collapse rather than erosion. The engineers exchanged a glance and began discussing structural integrity, their voices low and intent. The decision was made to deploy the ROV before committing any divers to the water. The lake's surface betrayed no hint of the power that Marcus knew lay beneath, but the technicians approached the task with the caution of people who had learned to trust instruments over appearances. The vehicle slipped into the water with barely a ripple, its tether feeding smoothly from the spool as it descended into the murk. On the monitor, the world shifted from sunlight to artificial glare. The first meters were clear enough, the familiar green haze of lake water illuminated by the ROV's lamps. Then the silt thickened. Fine particles drifted like snow in a black sky, reducing visibility to a tunnel that ended a few feet beyond the camera lens. The current became apparent in the way the drifting sediment bent inward. Its lazy fall turned into a steady slant toward the center. As the ROV approached the anomaly, its motion changed. The tether grew taut, the engineers compensating by increasing thrust to maintain position. Marcus felt a chill as he watched the water itself seem to tilt, drawn toward a point that remained just beyond the camera's reach. The monitor flickered as the sonar overlay was activated, revealing the contours of the void in stark relief. It was deeper than they had anticipated, its boundaries indistinct as though constantly being reshaped. Then the camera broke through the last veil of silt and the fracture appeared. It ran across the lake bed like a wound, a jagged opening whose edges crumbled even as the ROV hovered above it. Pebbles and clots of dark mud slid from the margins and vanished into the blackness below. The water did not fall so much as it was pulled, its movement accelerating as it neared the fissure. The effect was subtle on screen, but unmistakable in its implications. This was no stagnant hole. It was a conduit. The engineers began to call out readings, their voices clipped with urgency. Pressure differentials spiked near the opening, the instruments registering fluctuations that had no business existing in a placid mountain lake. Marcus leaned closer, straining to absorb every detail, his mind overlaying the image with the archival maps he had studied in the dim light of the archive room. Without warning, the ROV lurched forward. The tether jerked, the platform shuddering as the machine was tugged toward the fissure. The operator fought the controls, increasing thrust to counter the pull, and for a moment, the image blurred as the camera swung wildly. Marcus saw the fractured edges loom closer, the darkness below swelling to fill the screen. Someone shouted an order to abort. The winch engaged, reeling in the tether with a whine that cut through the hush of the lakeshore. The ROV clawed its way backward, its lights dancing across the broken lakebed as it retreated. Even as it cleared the immediate vicinity, the current continued to tug at it, a silent insistence that the lake was no longer in control of its own depths. When the vehicle finally broke the surface, dripping silt and pale streaks of mineral residue, the mood on the platform had changed entirely. The hydrologist, who had spoken so confidently that morning, stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the dark patch in the water as though it were an adversary. The engineers were already packaging the data, their faces set in lines that spoke of calculations being made faster than words could carry them. The discussion that followed was brief and decisive. No divers would be sent into the lake under these conditions. The fracture was actively drawing water, creating a downward current that could overwhelm even the most experienced technical team. The site would be evacuated until a full risk assessment could be conducted. Marcus felt a strange sense of vindication tempered by dread. The spiral he had watched grow from a curiosity into a threat had revealed its source, and it was worse than he had imagined. This was not a transient phenomenon that would fade with the season. It was a structural failure, an open wound in the earth beneath the reserve. As the specialists packed their equipment and prepared to leave, Marcus stood alone at the water's edge. The spiral continued its patient rotation, indifferent to the flurry of human activity around it. He realized then that the reserve was no longer simply his responsibility. Whatever lay beneath the lake had claimed a measure of agency of its own, and the calm that had defined this place for generations had been broken by a force that would not be easily contained. The departure of the technical team left the northern shore feeling strangely hollow, as though their brief intrusion had peeled back a layer of the reserve that could not be smoothed over again. Marcus watched the last truck vanish down the gravel road, its tires grinding the silence back into place, and then he turned toward the lake. The spiral was still there, turning with the same measured persistence it had displayed before any cameras or sonar beams had touched it. Yet, now he could no longer pretend it was merely a surface phenomenon. He had seen the fracture with his own eyes, its edges crumbling as the ROV fought to free itself from the downward pull. Within hours of the team's departure, calls began to filter in from regional offices. The data they had gathered was being circulated, examined, overlaid with decades-old geological surveys that had been gathering dust in forgotten cabinets. Marcus was asked to provide scans of the archival documents he had uncovered, and he complied, photographing every map and annotation he could find. Late that evening, he received a packet in return, a preliminary analysis compiled by a geologist who had spent his career studying abandoned industrial sites. The report did not mince words. Beneath the lake lay a complex of subterranean voids, the remnants of an exploratory operation that had never been properly sealed. In the 1950s, a consortium of mining interests had bored into what they believed to be a rich formation, only to intersect an extensive salt deposit that proved unstable and difficult to exploit. The project had been halted after a series of collapses threatened to trap workers underground. What remained was a labyrinth of partially flooded caverns reinforced by temporary supports that were never intended to bear the weight of decades. Marcus read the pages slowly, his finger tracing the diagrams that depicted a honeycomb of chambers extending beneath the northern half of the basin. The lake itself had been the final unintended consequence, its waters seeping through fractured layers of rock to fill the lowest voids. For years, the system had reached a precarious equilibrium. The mine cavities, brimming with water, had supported the overlying sediments like a hidden scaffold. But time had a way of eroding such compromises. Salt dissolved, supports decayed, and the pressure of the lake above continued to test the weakened roof. The mechanism that had birthed the spiral was laid out with unsettling clarity. A partial collapse in one of the upper chambers had opened a conduit between the lake bed and the deeper voids. As water began to drain through the breach, it created a siphon effect. The more water that flowed, the more sediment it carried with it, widening the fissure and accelerating the process. The vibration Marcus had felt through the rock was the subterranean echo of this erosion, the sound of an underground landscape being reshaped grain by grain. By the following morning, the first signs of this hidden struggle were evident on the surface. The lake level had fallen by several centimeters overnight, an unprecedented drop that left a wet scar around the shoreline. Marcus walked the perimeter with his measuring tape, documenting the retreat of the water from roots and stones that had not seen open air in years. In places, the exposed mud was stippled with small vents that exhaled bubbles of trapped gas, the earth sighing as its burden shifted. The implications were staggering. If the siphon continued to strengthen, it could drain the lake entirely into the mine complex below, leaving behind a hollowed basin and a web of unstable voids that threatened to collapse outward. The marshes that filtered the water would dry and die. The birds that depended on the sheltered coves would vanish. Trails, viewing platforms, and even sections of the ranger station itself lay within the zone of potential subsidence. The regional authorities convened a remote briefing that afternoon, looping Marcus in via a crackling video connection. Faces appeared on his screen in a grid of anxious expressions, each framed by the sterile light of distant offices. They spoke in cautious tones about mitigation strategies, about engineering firms that specialized in grouting and void stabilization. But every solution was burdened with caveats. The location was remote, the geology unpredictable, the water flow too strong to counter with simple barriers. Marcus listened, his eyes drifting to the window behind the screen where the northern wall of the lake lay just out of view. The reserve he had patrolled for years had become a case study in delayed consequence, a reminder that decisions buried in the past had a way of resurfacing when the conditions aligned. When the call ended, he remained seated at his desk for a long time, the hum beneath the floorboards a constant companion. That night, the ground tremors intensified. They were not earthquakes in the traditional sense, but a steady pulse that radiated outward from the spiral's unseen core. Marcus lay awake in his quarters, feeling the faint shudder in the bed frame, counting the seconds between the peaks as though he could chart the rhythm of collapse. He rose before dawn and made his way to the northern shore with a flashlight, its beam cutting a pale arc through the mist that clung to the water. The spiral greeted him with a new urgency. The depression in the surface was deeper, its edges more sharply defined. The foam seam that had once traced its outline was now a continuous ring of debris, circling faster than it had the previous day. He dropped a twig into the outer current and watched as it traced a tightening curve, its path accelerating with each revolution until it slipped beneath the surface and was gone. The soil along the ridge trail had shifted overnight. One of the fissures he had marked with a stake had widened, the gap now large enough to admit his fingers. He knelt and peered into it, his light revealing a darkness that seemed to breathe. A fine trickle of sand slid into the opening, vanishing soundlessly. He imagined the subterranean chambers below, their ceilings shedding fragments into the water-filled hollows, the entire system inching toward a critical threshold. By midday, the first external response team arrived, not with tools to repair the damage, but with barriers and warning signs. Their task was to delineate a zone of exclusion, to keep visitors and non-essential staff away from the most vulnerable areas. Marcus walked with them as they drove stakes into the ground and unfurled bright tape that fluttered uselessly in the still air. He knew the measures were necessary, yet they felt like a concession, an admission that the reserve was no longer a place to be stewarded so much as survived. As the afternoon waned, he returned to the water's edge and stood where he had first noticed the spiral weeks before. The lake whispered to him now, a constant undertone of movement that no longer tried to hide itself. Beneath his boots, the earth vibrated with a persistence that spoke of momentum, of processes set in motion that could not be halted by good intentions alone. He realized that the story of the reserve had entered a new chapter, one written not by glaciers or storms, but by the slow unraveling of a forgotten human intrusion, its consequences unfolding in the quiet heart of a wilderness that had always been trusted to endure. The morning after the exclusion zone was established, Marcus stepped out of the ranger station and felt at once that the air itself had changed. It was heavier, tinged with the damp mineral smell that had been creeping along the northern shore for days, and beneath it ran the familiar vibration that now seemed to thread through every surface in the reserve. He paused on the porch, looking out across the basin, and saw with a hollow certainty that the lake had receded again during the night. What had once required careful measurement to detect was now visible to the naked eye. A pale ring of exposed mud traced the shoreline like a wound that refused to close. The spiral had grown broader, its depression unmistakable even from the southern viewing platforms that were still open to the public. The water around it darkened in a gradient that deepened toward the center, as though the lake were being stretched thin over a void that demanded to be filled. Marcus walked the perimeter of the restricted area with a clipboard in hand, updating the warning placards that fluttered on their posts. The words felt inadequate against the quiet insistence of the phenomenon they were meant to describe. By midday, the first calls began to come in from hikers who had wandered too close to the barriers. Some were angry, insisting that they had visited the reserve for years without ever being told they could not approach the northern shore. Others were simply curious, craning their necks for a glimpse of the darkened water beyond the tape. Marcus found himself repeating the same calm explanation over and over, directing people back toward safer trails while keeping his eyes trained on the distant spiral. The ground beneath the ridge trail shifted again in the early afternoon. A section of packed earth gave way with a dull sigh, leaving behind a shallow sink that had not been there when Marcus had walked the path that morning. He knelt to inspect it, his fingers brushing against soil that was warm with the friction of recent movement. The tremor that accompanied the collapse rippled through the soles of his boots, a reminder that the reserve was no longer stable, even where the water could not reach. In the hours that followed, the lake began to behave in ways that defied every pattern Marcus had learned. The water level dropped in uneven pulses rather than a steady line, retreating a few centimeters and then holding as though gathering strength before the next pull. Along the newly exposed flats, schools of small fish flopped helplessly in shallow puddles, their scales catching the light in brief flashes before the water drained from beneath them. Birds wheeled overhead, calling sharply as they searched for the familiar shallows that had vanished almost overnight. The decision to close the northern half of the reserve was formalized just before dusk. Barricades were erected across secondary access roads, and a notice was issued that suspended all permits for overnight stays within a mile of the lake. Marcus oversaw the operation with a quiet intensity, aware that every barrier represented a concession to the unknown. When the last maintenance crew departed, leaving behind a forest of reflective signs, the basin felt eerily empty, as though the people had already abandoned it to its fate. Night fell without the usual chorus of frogs. The marshes nearest the spiral had begun to dry, their reeds lying limp against the cracked mud. Marcus walked the edge of the water with his flashlight, its beam skimming the rippling surface and catching on the occasional bubble that broke free from the depths. The sound beneath his feet was no longer subtle. It pulsed in steady waves, a subterranean breath that filled the silence with its own cadence. He was still on patrol when the first major collapse occurred. It began as a distant crack, a sharp report that echoed off the cliffs like a rifle shot. Marcus froze, his light swinging instinctively toward the sound. A moment later the ground trembled, not violently, but with a sickening softness that suggested yielding rather than resistance. He felt the vibration travel through his legs and into his chest, a low, rolling motion that carried the promise of something larger to come. From the center of the lake came a rush of movement. The spiral tightened abruptly, its edges drawn inward at a pace that Marcus had not yet witnessed. The depression deepened, forming a shallow funnel that bent the reflections of the stars into a warped pattern. He watched as a cluster of floating reeds was seized by the current and dragged toward the center, vanishing in a smooth, relentless slide. He radioed the main station, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline, and initiated the emergency protocol that had been drafted only days before. Roads were closed entirely, sirens sounding in the distance as local authorities moved to clear the surrounding trails. The reserve was transforming from a sanctuary into a hazard zone, and Marcus was acutely aware that he stood on the threshold between order and collapse. The hours before dawn were the longest of his career. He moved from checkpoint to checkpoint, confirming that no one had strayed past the barriers, his flashlight carving narrow tunnels of light through the darkness. Each time he paused, the hum beneath the earth seemed louder, more insistent, as though the hidden chambers below were demanding their due. Just before first light, the vibration intensified. Marcus stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the northern basin and felt the ground quiver beneath him in a way that left no room for doubt. The lake's surface convulsed, rippling outward from the spiral and concentric waves that shattered the mirror of the water. The depression widened, its edges collapsing inward as the lake surrendered another measure of its volume to the unseen voids below. When the sun finally crested the eastern ridge, it illuminated a landscape that Marcus barely recognized. The shoreline had retreated several meters in some places, leaving behind a labyrinth of wet channels that snaked across the exposed lake bed. The spiral remained at the center of it all, darker and more voracious than ever, its pull now visible in the very shape of the basin. He stood there in the early light, exhausted and resolute, knowing that the reserve had crossed a threshold from which there was no simple return. The calm that had once defined this place was gone, replaced by a slow catastrophe unfolding in plain sight. Whatever measures were taken next would be too late to restore what had been lost. They could only hope to contain the damage, to salvage what fragments of the lake's life might yet endure the relentless drain into the depths beneath. The collapse came without ceremony, as if the lake had decided that spectacle was unnecessary after all the warnings it had already given. Marcus was standing near the southern observation platform when he felt the first true shudder ripple through the basin, a deeper, heavier movement than any that had preceded it. The sound was not a crack or a roar, but a drawn-out groan that rose from the earth itself, reverberating through the exposed flats and into the timbers of the boardwalk beneath his boots. He dropped to one knee by instinct, gripping the railing as the vibration swelled and then eased, leaving behind a silence that felt as fragile as thin glass. A moment later, the water began to move in earnest. The spiral at the center of the basin no longer resembled a mere depression. It yawned open, its margins collapsing inward in slow, terrifying waves. The surface of the lake sagged, the water level falling visibly before his eyes as though someone had pulled the plug beneath the world. Marcus watched the retreat in disbelief, the pale scars of exposed mud racing outward from the epicenter, swallowing the last pockets of open water that had once reflected the mountains so faithfully. The air filled with a choking haze of moisture and silt as the retreating lake bed exhaled what it had held for decades. He could taste minerals on his tongue, a sharpness that burned at the back of his throat and carried with it the memory of buried places suddenly laid bare. The hum beneath the ground peaked and then fractured into a series of irregular tremors, each one shuddering through the exposed basin like the dying beats of a massive heart. When the movement finally slowed, Marcus forced himself to stand. What lay before him was not a lake, but a wound in the landscape, a sprawling depression riddled with channels of retreating water that converged on a central chasm. The fissure he had glimpsed on the ROV monitor had grown into a gaping rupture, and its jagged edges glistening with wet sediment and fragments of broken stone. Here and there, the remnants of old reinforcement protruded from the mud, rusted rods and warped planks that spoke of forgotten industry far more eloquently than any archive file ever could. He made his way down onto the exposed flats, careful to avoid the darker patches where the ground still shifted underfoot. Each step sank slightly into the silt, the surface trembling in protest, as though reluctant to bear weight after so long submerged. The channels carved by the draining water formed a chaotic map across the basin, their paths tracing the directions of hidden flows beneath the surface. He followed one of these lines toward the center until the air grew colder and the mineral smell sharpened, the earth opening into a cavernous hollow that swallowed the last trickles of the lake. Around him, the ecosystem he had known all his professional life lay in disarray. Fish, stranded in shrinking pools, twitched weakly, their gills flaring against the wrong medium. Clumps of reeds sagged on the damp flats, their roots exposed like veins torn from flesh. Overhead, birds circled in confusion, their calls echoing strangely across a space that had once been filled with water. News crews arrived by midday, their helicopters beating the thin mountain air into a frenzy as they hovered above the scene. Marcus kept to the perimeter, coordinating with emergency services and pointing out the zones where the ground remained unstable. He could see the shock mirrored in the faces of the responders, men and women who had expected a problem to manage, rather than a landscape to mourn. The scale of the transformation defied the language of reports and briefings. It demanded witness. By afternoon, the first analyses began to circulate. Engineers walked the basin with handheld scanners, their instruments mapping the newly revealed contours of the subterranean network. They pointed to collapsed ceilings and waterlogged chambers now visible through the ruptures in the lake bed, each one a testament to the gradual decay of human constructions left to the mercy of geology. Marcus listened as they explained how the influx of salt-laden groundwater would soon alter what little water remained, poisoning the basin's delicate balance beyond easy recovery. The long-term consequences unfolded with a grim clarity. Without the lake's stabilizing presence, the surrounding marshes would wither, their role as natural filters rendered moot. Species that had relied on the calm shallows for breeding would be forced to abandon the region, their absence echoing through the food chain in ways that could not yet be fully predicted. The reserve, once a model of ecological continuity, would become a case study in cascading loss. Amid the flurry of activity, Marcus found himself at the center of a quiet storm of scrutiny. His journals were requested, copied, dissected by investigators eager to trace the timeline of the collapse. Some of the questions carried an edge, as though the tragedy required a human focal point for its weight. He answered them all with the same calm precision he had brought to his daily patrols, pointing to dates and measurements, to the slow emergence of a pattern that had been invisible until it was too late to stop. In the late afternoon, when the crews had dispersed to their tasks and the helicopters had retreated to refuel, he returned to the edge of the basin alone. The light slanted low across the exposed flats, casting long shadows that accentuated the scars carved by the retreating water. He walked the former shoreline, tracing with his boots the line where the lake had once lapped against the roots of spruce and alder. Each step felt like a farewell to a version of the reserve that existed now only in memory. He paused where he had first noticed the faint distortion weeks earlier, standing on ground that had been submerged for most of his career. From this vantage, the central chasm lay open to view, a dark mouth in the earth that still whispered with the passage of hidden currents. He thought of the men who had bored into this formation decades before, their ambitions frozen in rust and rot beneath the weight of the mountains. They had left behind a problem that time had patiently nurtured until it could no longer be contained. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the temperature dropped sharply, and a thin mist began to rise from the damp basin. It softened the hard edges of the destruction, blurring the boundary between what had been and what now remained. Marcus stood within that veil, feeling the familiar vibration fade into a residual ache beneath his feet. The catastrophe had reached its crescendo, but its aftermath was only beginning. When he finally turned back toward the ranger station, he did so with the heavy knowledge that the reserve would never be the same. The calm that had once defined this place had been a fragile illusion, sustained by forgotten structures and deferred responsibility. Now, the truth lay exposed in the open basin, a testament to the cost of neglect and the slow, relentless power of forces set in motion long before he had ever walked these trails. If this story shocked you, don't forget to subscribe right now so you won't miss what comes next. Watch the next videos on the channel to discover more hidden truths and real-life mysteries that no one talks about. Share this video with your friends and let them see what was buried for decades beneath the surface.